At 2 a.m., HOA Karen tried to fine me $5,000, but the police lights behind her told a different story. The night felt carved from glass when the knock hit like a hammer on bone. Three hard strikes that split the silence and sent the porch light shivering across wet concrete as the black Brabus Porsche idled with a soft purr that sounded like trouble, trying to stay polite. And in the wash of its headlights, a figure planted herself at the foot of the steps, clipboard clenched, eyes bright with triumph as if she had waited for this exact minute to turn my home into a stage. Because who arrives at 2 in the morning with a fine already written and a smile that looks rehearsed for victory? And who believes the darkness will make everyone else bow first? My heart beat fast and controlled like a metronome in a war drum, because I knew the neighborhood, the fences, the cameras, the habit of curtains parting when anything expensive glowed against the curb, and the car was a magnet tonight with water beating on its hood like a crown of cold sparks while Karen pointed to it as if pointing at a confession, saying the noise shattered sleep and endangered peace and demanded discipline. And in her voice I heard more than rules. I heard a need to win, a story before the truth had a chance to breathe. So what story did she expect to finish before the sun could contest it? She waved a page and named a number heavy enough to bruise a person's month. 5,000 for the privilege of being awake and visible. 5,000 for headlights that touched her blinds. 5,000 for an engine that had barely cleared its throat. And the street felt like it leaned toward her to listen, because power loves confidence even when it is borrowed. And she carried herself like a borrowed badge, chin high and steps planted, already rehearsing the part where I would plead and fold. So who told her I would choose surrender over evidence? I stepped into the wash of the beams, and the air tasted like rain and metal and quiet warnings. And somewhere down the block, a dog gave one soft bark as if counting the seconds to something larger, because timing always means more than it admits at first glance. And behind the dog came a low hum that didn't belong to my car or the streetlights, a layered electric sound that rises before is seen. And if you have ever been under red and blue, you know the sound reaches you before the colors do. So why were the colors coming for a porch dispute that hadn't even finished opening its eyes? Karen didn't flinch at the approaching sirens because she had called them. I could tell by the way her shoulders loosened as if help had arrived to co-sign her certainty. And she announced that officers would teach me the cost of ignoring community standards, and the word community cracked in the air like a brittle ornament because community is a bridge you build, not a stick you raise. And I watched her rehearse the moment she wanted the whole neighborhood to remember, the part where she stands tall while I shrink. So why did her gaze keep flicking past me toward the camera above the door like a person afraid of a mirror? The cruisers rolled in slow and sure, lights washing the brick in alternating waves that made the house breathe in red and exhale in cool blue. And neighbors appeared as silhouettes in windows framed by condensation and curiosity. And with every new witness, Karen's voice climbed a rung, detailing a timeline that moved like a train with no room for other tracks. Engine revving at 157, headlights sweeping at 159. Porch disturbance at 2. Repeated disruption at 2:01. Fine issued at 2:02. And she threaded it all together like she was binding me to it. So if the timeline was perfect, why did the clock on my door camera blink 2:03 when the first knock landed? The officers approached steady, hands calm, eyes reading the space the way professionals do, checking angles, distances, exits, and their voices stayed even as they asked for context while Karen provided conclusions. And I could feel the moment trying to tilt me into anger, because anger is easier to discredit than facts. But I held the line and let the night do the talking, the rain ticking soft, the engine whispering steady, the camera recording the seconds that always tell the truth. And there was a flicker on the officer's radio that made him glance at the cruiser. So what message was threading through the air that Karen didn't prepare for? He paused at my steps, looked at the Porsche, then at the porch light, then at the small reflection of himself in the storm door, and he asked in a voice that carried no judgment why the car was on. And I told him without heat that the battery had been temperamental in the cold, and I was testing it for a minute before shutting it down. And I gestured toward the charger coil and the diagnostic app glowing on my phone with numbers that did not care about arguments. And he nodded like a man who knows machines try to fail when nights are hardest. So why did Karen's fingers tighten on the clipboard as if the paper might run away? She demanded a citation before patience spoiled, insisted that neighbors were terrified, that health and safety were at risk, that if they let one man bend rules, then every porch would become a club at midnight, and her words reached for the nearest fear because fear makes shortcuts feel righteous. But the officer raised a palm not to silence her, but to measure the space between claim and proof. And the radio crackled again with a tone that shifted the energy by a few hard degrees. The kind of tone that means a new thread is entering the weave. So what thread lands at 212 that makes confident people blink? It came through clear enough to cut tile. A dispatch note about a noise complaint logged earlier from the same street and resolved with a warning at a house whose porch camera was offline for reasons unknown, and the officer's eyes slid toward Karen's driveway like a compass finding north while her smile tried to stay. And the rain started again in tiny needles that made the lights look like a ribbon of glass falling in slow motion between us. And for a heartbeat, everything stilled as if the night wanted one clean breath before the next move. So why did a figure across the street pivot and start to walk fast the moment the officer asked who else had been awake at 1:30? I felt the moment branch into futures, one where I argue and drown in noise, and one where I let the facts collect like rain in a clear bowl while the street watches. And I chose the bowl because truth travels farther when it is carried rather than thrown. And I turned slightly so the porch camera framed the cruiser, the car, the clipboard, the faces, making a living timeline that cannot be interrupted. And I spoke low enough for the officers and loud enough for the lens about batteries and minutes, and a fine that arrived before a question could. So what happens to a script when the audience sees the rehearsal marks on its edges? If this were your home and your night and your name on a paper you never earned, would you sign to make the noise stop? Or would you stand and let the weight of the hour press against the facts until the facts refuse to bend? And would you breathe with me now and tap a like if you believe calm beats chaos when the stakes circle your door? Because this story belongs to anyone who has ever been accused by certainty before truth. And I want to hear in the comments what you would have done at 2 in the morning with lights in your windows and a fine in your face. So do you hold or fold when the street becomes your witness? The officer lifted his pen as if preparing to punctuate the night with a decision. Karen squared her shoulders as if stepping into a spotlight that existed only for her. The neighbors pressed closer to their frames, and the cruiser's radio gave one final pulse like a drum before judgment, a clean syllable carrying coordinates and confirmation. And in that brief silence between message and meaning, I could feel the ground tilt. Not against me, but toward the truth that had been circling since the first knock. So who exactly did dispatch say had triggered an earlier complaint from the same address before this porch ever woke? Dispatch answered the officer's question without stepping onto the street. A quiet confirmation sent through the radio that the first complaint of the night had pinged from Karen's address at 129. And the word earlier hung in the wet air like a light nobody had turned off because the truth had been awake longer than any of us admitted. So why did she look past the officer toward the treasurer as if a thread had snapped where she needed it tightest? The second officer unfolded the remaining pages from the envelope, and there it was, a draft schedule of fines pre-filled with my name and plate, time slots blocked like a calendar for humiliation, and notes about optics and enforcement that made the hair rise on every neck nearby because power wasn't being used. It was being choreographed. So who writes a punishment before the supposed crime and expects rain to hide the ink? Neighbors stepped onto porches now, robes drawn, arms folded, phones up, and in the reflection of their screens I saw how fear was switching sides. The way a current reverses in a tide as soon as the moon clears the clouds. And the treasurer shrank an inch without moving when the officer asked him to explain duplicate signatures that belonged to people 3 houses away who shook their heads in silent no's. So how long had this board spent practicing authority instead of earning it? My dashcam file sent over to the cruiser with a chirp, and the officer watched the clip of Karen circling the Porsche at 11:37, palm testing the hood, another clip at midnight showing her peering over the fence into a yard that never invited her, and a final clip at 1:21 of her arguing outside her own door with someone whose face never fully met the light. So why had her night been busy everywhere, except where honesty would have placed her? She clung to safety words like community and standards as if they could stitch up the whole dispatch had opened. But every time she said order, the radio echoed earlier, and the syllables kept cutting her narrative into softer pieces that no longer held weight. And the first officer asked for the HOA booklet and found revisions that weren't passed by a vote. Red lines turned black as if midnight itself had approved them. So when did a rule book become a costume instead of a guide? The treasurer tried to angle away, hand shaking around a phone that wanted to disappear, but the second officer leaned into the simple gravity of procedure and asked for the device. and on its screen lived threads with subject lines that read clean up before inspection and optics if challenged and escalation if he resists. And those words felt like pebbles dropped into a well whose bottom we hadn't reached yet. So what waited under those phrases if we kept lowering the bucket? I stood in the beam of my own headlights with the rain jeweled across my jacket and kept my breath disciplined because this was the moment when pride tries to steal your clarity, and I met the officer's eyes with a calm of a person who knows the camera will not forget him. I said what could be proven and nothing more. Then I looked into the lens above the door and asked anyone watching later to remember how a quiet engine was turned into a monster by a pen. So do you feel that pulse in your own chest where rage wants to speak before proof is finished? If you've ever watched a small lie, gather friends and walk like a giant, drop a heart and tell me in the comments where you drew your line. Because nights like this are not about a car or a curb, but about who gets to name the truth on your street. And if you stand for receipts over rumors, then like and subscribe so this story finds everyone who needs it the next time a clipboard knocks at midnight. So will you be? The investigator stepped from the sedan like a hinge turned by purpose, coat catching rain, eyes mapping the street with quiet geometry, while the cruisers dimmed their sirens to a heartbeat and the neighbors clutched their screens closer, and he listened to the first officer's summary without interrupting, gaze flicking to Karen, to the treasurer, to the envelope inside the evidence bag, then to the camera over my door as if checking whether the night itself would corroborate. So why did the or feel like it had been waiting specifically for him to arrive? He asked dispatch to replay the earlier call, and the timestamp rolled back to 1:29 with the origin pinned to Karen's porch. And he noted the offline camera at her address the way a surgeon notes a missing chart before a procedure, not dramatic, just decisive. Then asked her why a security device that is always on had chosen this night to sleep, and her answer wandered through storms, outages, and vague maintenance that never met a date. So when did coincidence start dressing like an alibi? The treasurer shifted as the investigator reviewed the pre-filled fine schedule, tracing the identical loops of a forged signature with the tip of a pen he never uncapped, then asked a question, so light it almost floated about discretionary fund transfers labeled community silence and optics package. And the words made the street tilt because money always makes shadows look like plans rather than accidents. So what ledger learns to speak only when rain is listening? Neighbors edged closer to their railings as the investigator requested access to the HA office, a converted utility room by the pool with a keypad lock and a cabinet where bylaws should sleep in peace. And Karen said policies prohibited entry at this hour, while the treasurer said the keys were not available, and the investigator simply extended a hand to the first officer for a property access form that made the protest evaporate like breath on cold glass. So what door stays shut when a lawful knock arrives with a pen that knows the code? We walked as a group past mailboxes shining with fresh water, and the black Porsche breathing a low idle that felt like patience rather than power, and the pool fence through lattice shadows across the path as the investigator held his phone near the keypad, capturing a reflection in the chrome that revealed fingerprints sweeping a pattern only hours old, and he asked whose hands had updated bylaws at midnight while votes slept. So who edits a neighborhood like a script and expects the audience to clap on cue? Inside the office, the air smelled like printer heat and damp cardboard, and on the desk sat a decibel meter still glowing with a reading locked from earlier, but the brand logo was a skin over an app that any phone could mimic, and the investigator lifted the device and scanned its serial only to find it belonged to a demonstration unit never sold. And the treasurer's shoulders buckled as if a string had been cut where posture had been tied. So what happens when a prop forgets its lines under a real light? The first officer mirrored the treasurer's phone to the cruiser display with a quick handshake and a permission click he gave with shaking fingers, and up came threads with images of the meter screen captured alongside a caption reading schedule the knock for 2 and film his reaction for optics. And the room changed temperature even though no window had opened because staging is colder than conflict, and everyone could feel it settling on the table like frost. So what story survives when the behind the scenes becomes the only scene that matters? If you have ever watched a small circle of authority try to script your life and felt that quiet surge that says not tonight, tap like so this message travels farther than this block. And tell me in the comments where you drew your line when rules became weapons on your street. And if you want to see these moments end with truth walking out upright, subscribe so you are here the next time calm and evidence have to outlast noise and posture. Because whose porch gets tested next if we do nothing? Now. The investigator asked me whether I wished to file for harassment, attempted fraud, and trespass, and the question landed like a weight that steadied rather than burdened because it meant the night had crossed from chaos to record. And I said yes with a kind of yes that closes doors on old versions of yourself who stayed quiet to be neighborly. And two neighbors stepped forward to add statements about earlier nights when fines were rehearsed like hymns. So, what shape does courage take when it stops being private and starts being contagious? We moved back to the office cabinet where folders waited with the patience of paper, and the investigator slid out a stack labeled Emergency Revision stamped with a date that matched tonight's rain, then found a flash drive taped beneath the drawer with ordinary tape that suddenly looked like confession, and on it lived a spreadsheet mapping future fines to future complaints that had not yet existed. Each cell a plan to turn disagreement into revenue. So how much does a silence cost when it is sold like a subscription? Outside, the pool lights hummed and the street lights painted long lines across the water like a graph of the neighborhood heartbeat, and the investigator asked for the audit log on the keypad, revealing entries at 12:21, 12:59, and 1:14, each tagged to a code assigned to the treasurer. While a camera near the pool door delivered a grainy clip of Karen carrying a stack of signs that read quiet hours while she spoke into her phone with a smile that did not belong to concern. So what motive wears a mask labeled order and hopes nobody checks beneath? The second officer radioed a supervisor who authorized temporary control of the office, and the investigator sealed the flash drive and printed schedule, then stepped into the doorway with the kind of pause professionals use when they know a missing piece is about to declare itself. And that was when a far siren threaded into the block from the south, moving slow and deliberate, while a gray hatchback rolled toward us with its trunk half closed over a portable shredder that still wore a store sticker. So which board member was driving at 2:30 with a machine that eats paper? And why did the hatch look like it was breathing? The hatchback eased to the curb and the driver lifted a hand as if casual arrival could clean the timing. But the port of the shredder still held a paper tongue that fluttered in the night air like a warning flag, and the investigator nodded once to the first officer who stepped into the lane with a palm that asked for stillness and truth, and the neighbors fell silent the way theaters go quiet before a reveal, because everyone could sense the next frame. So what pages were inside that trunk? And how many names did the machine intend to swallow before Dawn tried to rewrite our street? The driver froze halfway out of the hatchback as if the night had turned to glass and one wrong move might shatter it, his eyes darting between the shredder and the investigator like a man calculating whether to run or talk first, and the paper tongue in the machine's mouth trembled under the weight of every phone camera now aimed his way. So what truth curls at the edge of a shredder blade when the whole street is watching? The investigator approached without raising his voice, just a calm step at a time, rain brushing off his coat in small silver arcs, and he asked for the keys, not as a request but as a fact that was already true. And the driver's hands shook as they obeyed, metal clinking against metal before landing in the investigator's palm with the sound of a decision being made. So why does surrender sound quieter than defiance when guilt is heavy in the air? The trunk lifted the rest of the way, and the first officer reached in to remove the shredder, setting it on the wet pavement where its plugged trail like cut wire, and inside its bin were strips of paper still warm from the motor, strips with lines of text too short to name fully, but long enough to read phrases like unauthorized vote and pre-approved penalty, each one a fragment of a scheme that didn't survive the machine's teeth. So what kind of order tries to live on scraps? Karen's voice finally cracked into the scene, brittle and loud, claiming the driver was acting alone, claiming she had no knowledge of any documents being destroyed. But the treasurer's glare toward her sliced through the pretense like glass underfoot, and the driver, whose name rippled through the crowd in whispers, kept his eyes down as the investigator asked why the shredder still wore its price tag. And the silence that followed was more telling than any answer. So who buys a machine at midnight and expects it to be invisible? The investigator pulled on gloves and began piecing together a few of the wider strips, laying them on a hood of the cruiser where red and blue light washed over the words, and there it was in black ink, a schedule of fines with my name, my plate, and notes about optics for the upcoming board vote, a script that mirrored the envelope from earlier but carried new details about timing police involvement for maximum embarrassment. So who exactly was running this play, and who else had a role? Neighbors stepped forward now with their own stories, short and sharp, about late-night knocks, sudden fines, and meetings moved without notice, and the investigator noted each one like nails into a board, building a structure too solid to ignore. And the driver finally muttered that the shredder was for cleaning up old drafts, but when asked why the drafts included dates in the future, his words stumbled into the kind of silence that admits more than it hides. So when does cleanup become cover up? If you've ever had to watch someone try to erase the truth before it could speak, hit like so this story finds the people who need it most, and drop in the comments what you'd have done if this machine had rolled up your street tonight. And if you want to see more nights in with the right people held accountable, subscribe so you're here when the next set of lights turns down your block. Because what's the point of a camera if we never aim it at the dark corners? The investigator ordered the shredder and its contents into evidence bags, sealing them tight, and then turned his focus on Karen with a precision that made the street lean forward, asking her to explain why her name appeared in a thread from the treasurer's phone, instructing the driver to clear the sensitive ones first. And she tried to twist the words into something harmless, but the rain on her face made it look like she was sweating. So what happens to a leader when the people stop following? The first officer read her rights in a tone that left no gaps, each word hitting the pavement with the weight of a step forward, and the driver followed suit, his wrists catching the reflection of the cruiser lights as they were brought together in front of him, and the treasurer's silence deepened into something that sounded like resignation. So who would be next when the investigator decided the net wasn't finished closing? From the edge of the crowd, an elderly neighbor stepped out holding a manila folder wrapped in plastic, saying he had kept copies of all HOA communications for years just in case. And when he handed it to the investigator, the street seemed to breathe, because inside were letters and notices that matched the forged documents exactly, down to the formatting, proving they were part of a long-running pattern. So how far back did this stretch, and how many nights had been rewritten without witnesses? The investigator thanked him and turned back toward the office, instructing the officers to secure the building entirely until the audit was complete. And as we walked past the Porsche, its headlights cut through the mist in long, clean beams, a reminder of how this all started. The investigator's phone screen glowed against the rain, casting a faint light on his expression as he read the message twice before slipping it back into his coat, his pace tightening as he motioned for the officers to hold Karen, the treasurer, and the driver exactly where they were. And without raising his voice, he said there might be more addresses involved, more than just this block. So why did the night suddenly feel like the first chapter instead of the ending we thought was coming? He asked me to walk with him back toward the HOA office, the cruisers throwing muted colors against the damp pavement, and once inside he powered on a confiscated laptop pulled from the cabinet earlier, scrolling through folders labeled in polite terms: community outreach, maintenance, meeting prep, each one a mask over spreadsheets mapping residents' personal details, fines, and so-called behavioral notes. And in the corner of one file sat a tab marked escalation plan. So who writes escalation into the rules of a neighborhood? The file opened into a chart with columns for complaint source, target name, method, and expected outcome, and my name appeared twice alongside tonight's date, the method reading noise at 2 a.m., the outcome reading board vote leverage, and down the list were others. Neighbors I'd seen walking dogs, watering flowers, waiting for mailboxes, each paired with tactics designed to corner them into compliance or shame. So what kind of authority survives once people see exactly how it plans to break them? Outside, the crowd had grown thicker, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers under the streetlights as word traveled house to house, and the driver sat in the back of a cruiser staring at his hands while Karen kept her gaze locked on the wet ground, the treasurer whispering something only the rain could hear, and the investigator stepped out holding printed copies of the escalation plan for the officers to log. So why did the neighbors' murmurs sharpen into anger instead of fear? One neighbor, a woman with silver hair pulled back tight, stepped forward to tell the investigator she'd been fined twice for curtain violations when her drapes were the same one she'd had for years. Another said his son's bike had been labeled an obstruction and removed from the porch without notice, and each story added weight to the night until the air felt charged, not with panic but with resolve. So how quickly does fear turn into the will to push back when the curtain falls? The investigator raised his hand to quiet the voices and told everyone this was now part of a broader fraud and harassment investigation, that statements would be taken and evidence preserved, and if anyone had recordings, letters, or fines they believed unjust, they should bring them forward. And from the shadows at the edge of the block came two more neighbors carrying boxes, one labeled 2019, the other 2020. filled with envelopes that matched the forged patterns exactly. So what happens when? History shows the scheme isn't a glitch but a design. If you've ever lived under rules written to protect someone's power instead of the community, hit like so this story finds the people who need to hear it, and tell me in the comments how you'd respond if you discovered your neighborhood was keeping files like these. If you want to be here when stories like this find their full ending, subscribe so you're part of the fight to keep the lights on in places where shadows try to set the rules. Because who else is going to turn them back on if not us? The treasurer's voice finally broke through the night, low and trembling, saying this wasn't just Karen's idea, that she'd been acting on orders from a regional HOA coordinator who promised funding and legal cover for aggressive enforcement, and the driver nodded in reluctant agreement, adding that the shredder was for documents tying multiple neighborhoods into the same pattern. So where does a local dispute end when the strings reach farther than the street signs? The investigator called in the update, his tone shifting into the clipped precision of someone building a case with both hands, and the response came back that a warrant request was already in motion for the regional coordinator's office, and the rain seemed to pause on the air as if listening, the crowd holding still as Karen realized the walls she thought she controlled had been pulled outward into a map she couldn't see the edges of. So what happens to control when it's swallowed by something larger than itself? I stood by the Porsche, the reflection of the cruiser lights rippling across its hood, and thought about how this all began with a knock, a fine, and a smirk in the dark, and now the street felt like a courtroom without walls, neighbors shifting from spectators to witnesses, each one realizing they weren't alone, and the energy was no longer just about me or tonight, but about every future knock they refused to fear. So what shape will this block take when the people who live here start drawing the lines themselves? The investigator returned to Karen and asked one final question before they moved her to the cruiser. Did she want to cooperate now or after the charges were filed? And she stared at him for a long breath, rain streaking her face, before glancing at the treasurer and the driver with something between warning and surrender, then looking back to say she'd talk, but only if they kept certain names out of the public record. So what names could be heavy enough to make even her hesitate in the middle of a collapse? The officers guided her into the back seat, closing the door with a solid click that seemed to signal the night was shifting toward its next act. And as the investigator walked back toward me, he said quietly that the real work was just beginning, because the scheme stretched farther than any of us guessed, and his phone buzzed again with a new update from the warrant team, the words lighting the screen like a fuse. Document seized. Coordinator in custody. So what would we find when the papers from that office were laid beside the ones pulled from our own quiet street? The investigator's words settled over the street like the first crack of sunlight before dawn, not bright enough to warm yet, but certain enough to change the night's shape, and the murmurs of neighbors quieted as the cruisers prepared to transport Karen, the treasurer, and the driver, each one framed in the glow of lights that had shifted from chaos to confirmation. So why did the air feel heavier now that victory was within reach? He told me the coordinator's arrest had already yielded more files, mirrors of the same forged fines, staged incidents, and intimidation tactics, but this time spread across neighborhoods miles apart, each one a copy of the same playbook we just ripped apart. And it became clear this was never just about one car, one porch, or one night. So how many people had stood alone in their driveways thinking they were the only target? The boxes from earlier were lined along the curb under a canopy to keep them dry, neighbors flipping through their own histories with expressions that shifted from disbelief to recognition, reading letters they remembered crumpling in frustration years ago, and each discovery felt like a thread being pulled from a fabric that had wrapped too tightly around this place. So what happens when a whole street starts unspooling the same knot together? One by one, residents stepped forward to give formal statements, the investigator's notepad filling with dates, times, and patterns too consistent to be coincidence, and every new detail seemed to build a wall, not to keep anyone out, but to keep this from happening again, a structure made from truth rather than fear. So why does shared anger feel so different from the private kind when it's pointed at the right target? Karen sat in the back of the cruiser, her posture collapsed into the corner, the earlier steel in her gaze replaced by something quieter, like someone replaying each decision that led her here. And the treasurer stared at his shoes while the driver leaned his head against the glass, both of them knowing the investigation had climbed past their pay grade. So what kind of loyalty survives when the chain of command starts to break? The investigator asked me if I wanted to be notified about the broader case as it unfolded, and I said yes, Not just for me, but for the neighbors who had stood outside tonight in the cold to make sure this didn't end in silence. And he nodded, saying the fight wasn't over yet, but that the most dangerous part, the part where people believe nothing will change, had already been broken. So is this what hope feels like when it's earned instead of handed out? If you've been following this story and you've ever had to face down someone abusing their position, hit like so more people hear it and drop your own story in the comments so others know they're not alone. And if you want to be here when we follow this all the way to the end, subscribe so we can walk into the next chapter together. Because justice is louder when we stand shoulder to shoulder. So will you stand with us when the lights go on? The rain began to thin, each drop falling slower as if the night was letting go. And the investigator gave the signal for the cruisers to roll, their engines low and steady as they pulled away, carrying the weight of the names and evidence that would now belong to the courts, and the crowd stayed even after the last tail light turned the corner, unwilling to break the circle until the moment felt complete. So what makes people linger in the street when the danger is gone? I walked back to the Porsche, the hood cool now, the reflection of the street lamp stretching long and clean across the wet paint, and I thought about how close I came to signing that fine just to make the noise stop, how easy it would have been to give them exactly the victory they wanted, and how different the street looked now that we had all stood our ground together. So what would have been lost if I had taken the easy way out? The investigator stopped beside me before leaving, his voice steady but carrying the weight of a man who had seen this kind of thing too often, telling me to keep the footage, the paperwork, and every record of tonight because cases like this are marathons, not sprints, and that sometimes the people you think are gone find ways to come back. So will I be ready if they ever try to write my name into their story again? Neighbors began drifting back to their homes, each step echoing softer until the street was just the rain and the hum of the pool filter. And I stood there for a moment longer, breathing the clean air that always comes after a storm, knowing the real storm had been people, not weather, and that it had passed for now. So what kind of night leaves you both exhausted and more awake than you've ever been? By the time I closed the door behind me, the clock read just past 4, and the porch light caught the last drops clinging to the rail, each one a reminder that no one wins by staying quiet when they're right, and that sometimes the only way to protect your home is to make the whole street see what's been hiding in plain sight. So what would you have done if it were your name on that clipboard at 2 in the morning? And would you have been ready to fight until the lights came back on?